and there are some incredibly elegant things going on. And I always remember, having been, as a young Christian, studying biology, sitting in biology lectures, looking at it and thinking, just going into worship because the elegance of it, and it's like there is a designer behind this.
Okay, Pam Jones, welcome to the Life Explored podcast.
Nice to meet you, Wes.
So just to kind of introduce and give a bit of background, you were operations manager for the NISCU for 14 years. That's the...
We call it NISCU, Northern Interschools Christian Union.
Yeah. For
the last 17 years.
And you've recently retired?
Yeah, just end of last summer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You've been a street pastor.
I have.
You're a wife and a mother. You were a mother for 10 years. You were a
full-time stay-at-home
mother.
Yeah.
But also a teacher, and that is a teacher of school science and of faith.
Yeah.
Biblical teacher.
Yeah.
And also a scientist. You have a distinguished academic background. You've got BSc, MSc, MA, PhD, any kind of three letters, four letters, you've got them.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you became a Christian after being invited to a Christian Union meeting by one of your friends, enticed by the promise of cake.
Indeed, I did.
Have I got all that right?
Yes. Yeah, that's called
Excellent.
Cake Evangelism, and I highly recommend it.
Excellent. Well, I think what we really want to do is just explore a little bit about you. I've got some questions to ask you now, and we'll dive into some of that background. So, first things first, Pam, was there anything you would like to sort of introduce about yourself on top of that, what we've just gone through?
Oh, well, maybe some of my connections into rugby.
Yes, go ahead, yeah.
I mean, my husband and I met at Bible Week, and so we've been connected with the same movement as Alan Scotland for over 30 years. And it's been like a wonderful journey for us as a Christian family. David, my husband, he had his 40th birthday on honeymoon. He was a slow starter, but it was just a really great connection that we made, and I enticed him up to Lancaster, where I was living in those days. And after 3 years of marriage, we had our son, who I believe may be known in the rugby church.
Nathan, yeah.
And I think most people know Nathan, and it was quite fun actually to come down to rugby and find that I had a new title, which was Nathan's mum.
Yeah, Nathan, our technical guru for the podcast, actually. So yeah, he's the one who makes it all work and run here.
And I should say that every time I mention his name, we've had a long-standing arrangement ever since he was very young, that whenever I'm speaking in any kind of forum, if I mention his name, I owe him £1. So I think he will be adding up.
What's the backstory to that then? Why is that?
Sorry, say again.
Why would you owe him £1?
Because he was like, I'm not sure you should be mentioning about me, Mum. And I said, well, I'll tell you what, if you let me mention your name, I'll give you £1. So and that's been going on ever since he was like quite small.
Wow. Okay. Well, that must be quite a racket then, I imagine.
It could be.
All that money he's got, that will drip.
And feel free to cut any of that out.
That's right. The coffees are on you, Nathan, then for the next podcast, I think. Okay, well, all right. So, okay, Pam, I'm going to launch into some questions here, okay?
Yeah.
So previously, you've described your arrival at Lancaster University as being fueled by a love of Burkitt's Cornish pasties. Is that correct?
Indeed.
And rather than your intellectual prowess. You're also lured to Lancaster Christian Union by promise of cake.
Yep.
All right, as we mentioned. So looking back, have you seen any other ways that God steers our direction and motivates us through food?
Coffee.
Yeah.
Coffee's got to be up there, hasn't it?
Mm-hmm.
You know, meeting in coffee shops, sitting around coffee and giving testimonies and just chatting with people in that kind of context. We have the most wonderful coffee shop in Lancaster, which is in a 12th century castle. I mean, what could be better than sitting in a 12th century castle and drinking some of the best coffee on earth,
Yeah.
made in the proper way, and just sitting around and chatting about the gospel with people.
You saying we don't get better coffee down south here? You know?
Yeah, and going to Christian festivals and saying to the teenagers, "Come on, let's go get a drink," and sitting around in a cafe and just chewing the cud with them, no agenda, just showing them some love and just buying them a drink and a cake and saying, "Come on, what's going on in your life? What's happening?"
Do teenagers drink a lot of coffee? Because I think when I was a teenager, I remember, I didn't really like tea or coffee. I was more like into...
They don't drink
Hot.
tea. Well, some of them do, but mostly it's a cold drink. But
Yeah.
But it doesn't really matter.
It's
The
really-
cake,
the point
the cake
is-
is always a draw.
The point is it's providing that sort of liquid providing that sort of tool to have a sit down
It's
and a
just-
talk
yeah.
and a chat.
And also, I find that a key with teenagers is don't make eye contact. I know, like when you're speaking with, you're supposed to make eye contact and connect with them. But with teenagers, they get all shy and embarrassed,
Yes,
and then they start speaking in grunts, and you need the gift of interpretation. But if you don't make eye contact, you sit side by side.
Yeah.
So, like, and this is going to cost me £1, when Nathan and his dad talked, it was in the car, when they were both facing forward and looking out.
Yeah.
That's when they would talk.
Yeah.
Or when we would talk would be swimming lengths in the swimming pool, up and down. Right, what's going on in your life? Or Mum, can I ask you a question? And we'd be swimming the pool and not making eye contact somehow releases them to talk. So
I think
that
men
tip
are like
comes
that
for free
very
for all
much.
youth workers.
Yeah, I think men are like that. Actually, I find men always tend to look ahead as they talk, and we're very sort of fixed on things, So that makes sense. Okay, so just to switch subject, so you've previously mentioned that you went from swearing like a docker to suddenly stopping almost overnight upon becoming a Christian.
Yeah.
What's another habit you've unexpectedly shed or adopted with a similar sense of divine intervention or lack thereof?
Well, other than the swearing, I mean, that is the one that I like most often tell because it was the most pointed, very sudden change in my life. And normally in the Christian life, changes come slowly and you have to work at them a little bit. But that was one that just kind of it was like a flip of a switch in my head. Actually becoming the Christian was like that because, when my friend said to me, "Oh, come to this Christian meeting," I was like, well, I'm not coming to a Christian meeting. I'm an atheist. And I was quite a loud-mouthed atheist. And I was voted the person least likely to become a Christian in my kind of group of friends. And this girl, Joan, her name was, she said to me, "No, please come, because we have to take a guest and I'll be really embarrassed if I don't take a guest." And I was like, "It's not going to happen." She said, "There's cake." I said, "What time would you like me there?" So that... And
You're very food motivated.
We get there and we go into this meeting, which was in the chaplaincy centre at Lancaster University. And we sit down in this meeting. There was cake. It was very nice cake. And this man was like speaking, and it was the first time I'd really heard the gospel presented. And I started to understand some things about myself, some of the issues that I'd wrestled with as a teenager. Like, how do you make your mark in life? How do you have any sense of purpose in life? And these are the kinds of, what meaning is there in it all? And I do think that young people wrestle with that kind of thinking, those kinds of issues. And one of the things for me as well was if I'd done something wrong or said something nasty to somebody, the guilt, I would feel guilty, and I had no means of dealing with that guilt. And so when this man was standing there saying, "Oh, do you need purpose in life? Do you have problems? Do you feel you've done something wrong and you feel guilty about it and you don't know what to do with that?" And he started to talk about Jesus, and he talked about how Jesus bridges that gap, and takes all of that upon himself and takes it to the cross, and then 3 days later rises from the dead to say, "Hey, come on, it's dealt with. It's finished." And there is a way forward. And somewhere in the midst of that, something flipped in my head. And I went into that meeting an atheist, and I came out a Christian. And he said at the end, "Does anybody want to, pray this prayer and become a Christian?" My hand went straight up in the air, and my friend fell off her chair because she was so shocked at, that this very sudden change.
Well, that actually does lead to my next question. Actually, it's interesting that you have a science background. You were when you went to university, you were studying science at that time. So and you had this kind of atheist outlook.
Yeah.
And so, having transitioned from the science background to a master's in missional leadership, what key insight or principle from missional leadership that you find surprising and relevant to your scientific understanding of the world, or vice versa?
I mean, the thing that needs to be said is that Christianity and science are not in competition with each other. And one of the things that I particularly learned was reading a Christian historian called Rodney Stark, about, I think his book's called something like How Christianity Changed the World or something like that. And he talks about how science and the scientific process that we're all reasonably familiar with because we've done a bit in school and things like that. But we have the idea of it being evidence-based and forming a hypothesis and doing experiments to prove or disprove the hypothesis, and then moving on from there, and that whole process. Why did that process come about? It came about because Christians saw that there is a God of order, and if there's a God of order, then there must be laws in the universe, and they must be discoverable. So let's do some science and discover what they are. So you could talk, Isaac Newton, Boyle, all kinds of scientists in all kinds of fields, in that kind of era, who basically invented the scientific process because they said there's a God of order, so let's discover the order.
I think that's like a very interesting thing, because I that's something I've noticed. I've been researching, putting and looking into lately, which is, mathematical rules that are in the universe. So you have Fibonacci sequence, you have fractals, and the amazing thing about fractals is they're based on calculations, and you have this infinite sort of there's an infinite quality to them, a characteristic, in that I think, to explain it, to make it quite simple for people who are not able to follow that, it's almost like the number 3, for example. It's kind of if you try to divide 10 by 3, you end up with a 3.33333. If you do it on a calculator, it runs out of numbers, and it'll go 334. But in actual reality, it's just eternal. It goes on 33333. There's just no end to it. And then when you put that into sort of these algorithms, these kind of quite complex mathematical algorithms, you can come up with these fractals that just spiral and spiral and spiral. But the one thing that is amazing about them is not just this mathematical equation. It's that if you stand back and look at the fractals, they're actually quite pretty. There's design, there's a beauty to them, right?
And more than that, when you go into nature, you see these things being repeated over and over and over and over again in nature. So, for example, if you go in a woodland, you'll find quite a common plant in a woodland. It's a thing called dog's mercury.
Right.
And the leaves come in threes around the stalk at precisely the right number of, is it 45 degrees or whatever it is, so that they're equally spaced. But then the next one up the stem is slightly offset. The next one up the stem is slightly offset. If you look down from the top, it looks like a spiral.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you see these kinds of things over and over.
Yeah. Yeah.
And DNA is the perfect example.
DNA, yeah. So I learned a lot about that in my time working in like a genomics company. You know, I'm not a scientist, but I learned a little bit, for the job. And,
it's amazing.
And something that struck me, from my background, sort of technology background, coding, everything, something that struck me immediately about DNA were the 4 nucleotides.
Yeah.
C, A, G, and T. They represent the scientific names, which I can't remember, but it's C, A, G, and T. They are like pure code. They're like programming. It's like you can, the Human Genome Project is very interesting. I'm sure you know a bit about this already, but so correct me if I make any missteps here. But they take a sort of approximately 100 people, random people, and it's mostly Northern Europe. Apparently, there's so much of a genome outside of Northern Europe that we don't know about yet.
Yeah.
But there are programs that are ongoing for that. But they take a random assortment of 100 people who are approximately sort of, I'd say, healthy human beings, or just kind of like fairly normal, average human beings. And what they've done is they merge all those into one. And so they can look and say, right, well, at each point within the DNA code, that's an A, that's a T, that's a C, that's a G. And so we can pretty much establish that a normal human being, healthy human being always has this here, right? And so then when they start looking at diseases and predicting for diseases, what they look at is like, oh, where the human genome normally has an A here, it's a C, or it's 2 A's, or it's missing, or something like that. And then they map that back to like, we have a person who's got a problem, there's something wrong with their body, a disease of some kind, or a genetic deformity or something. And in their cases, whenever we see this difference from the genome, that person, that we see that kind of thing happen in that person, And to me, it's like, well, that's like a set of instructions. It's like and I know if I write code, if I write a script and I write code and I alter a variable there, well, something else is going to happen. It's not going to work. And there's also almost in DNA, sort of the same principles. If it's not repeated correctly, and it's fascinating.
It is fascinating, and there are some incredibly elegant things going on. And I always remember having been, as a young Christian, studying biology, sitting in biology lectures, looking at it and thinking, just going into worship because the elegance of it, and it's like there is a designer behind this. I remember learning about there's a particular kind of virus that is minute, right? Really, really minute. They're all small, but really minute. And the reason it gets away with it is because its DNA code is round in a circle, and it starts at one point and reads around the circle, and it gets one set of proteins. Then it moves on one base, goes around the same circle, the same code, but gets a completely different set of proteins, and does the same thing a third time, by which time it's got enough proteins to do what it does.
Right, yeah.
And it was learning about that, sitting there, it's just incredible. It's just incredible, the elegance. And it's not just clever, but it's elegant, it's beautiful.
And that was the thing that one of the things that sort of converted you when you started out as a scientist and looking at these things. That was one of the things that kind of converted you to Christianity, because you looked at this and you thought, this is so weird. There's a design to this. you know, and we're not talking about intelligent design. We're not saying, you know, obviously you can infer that, but I mean, you're just looking purely at the scientific scenario, what you can see, and you're going, this is somewhat like a machine. It's like some intelligence has made this happen. You know,
That's right.
It feels like, because there's certain things I think in nature where it's like, there's that question there, chicken and the egg. What come first, the chicken and the egg, right? And what's interesting about that is one can't exist without the other.
Yeah.
So, you know, you have that question of, there are certain things I think in nature, certain mechanics, which it's like, you know, they had to have evolved separately, but with a codependence, I suppose.
Yes.
You know.
Let me give you the perfect example that we all live and breathe.
Mm-hmm.
We breathe.
Mm-hmm.
That's called aerobic respiration. But in order to get aerobic respiration, you have to have a first stage, which is anaerobic, so not using oxygen, produces two molecules of the energy molecule, which is called ATP. In order to get aerobic respiration from that, you have to use up those two units of energy, those two molecules of ATP, in order to drive the aerobic respiration, which then gives, forget what it is, I think it's something like 36 molecules of ATP, right. But anyway, significantly more energy out from that process. But aerobic respiration is an incredibly complicated metabolic pathway. So you have to have the whole thing in place, because otherwise you're going to use up your 2 units of energy and die.
Yeah.
Unless you can go through the whole process. So, and this was a significant moment for me. So I say I went in an atheist, came out a Christian, and that is true. But I hadn't realised how much was really going on in my head in the background. And one of the significant moments was when I went into my very first biochemistry tutorial as an undergraduate student in my first year. There's about half a dozen of us went into this tutorial, sat down, and the guys in his office, was a room about this size actually, and imagine the whole of that wall covered in metabolic pathway, all in normal script, not big, but just in normal script, and the whole wall covered in all of the different aspects of the metabolic pathway that were required. And we all walk in and we sit down, and this professor said, take a look. And we all looked. And he said, how did that evolve? And none of us had an answer. And I was being a clever. Yeah. If you knew me, I can be like that. I just said, oh, God? This is the atheist talking,
Yeah.
But coming away from that, it's like, I don't have an answer to that question. And therefore, actually, I need to look into this more deeply. And fairly soon after that, so I suppose in a sense, I've been prepared in my thinking and in my heart, really, to be receptive to the message that man gave out on the day I ate the cake.
Yeah, I think it's, and I think that's what's really cool about that is, like, it was just something you found through asking questions and through just looking at it. It's like nobody came along and tried to convince you. It wasn't like there was a science versus religion debate or anything like that. You were just looking at, like, kind of the science, and going, there's something about this which just, it doesn't add up randomly, And
the interesting for me personally, and this is very personal, because it was never in my intention to go to Lancaster University and study biological sciences. My intent and my plan, because it was the area that I was the most interested in, was to go to Nottingham University and study genetics. And I had my place secured. I just needed to get the A-level grades. And it was, for me, it felt like such a massive, massive failure in life, because I was one of those people who, I was quite a bright cookie, You know, I was probably top of the class and all of that kind of thing. But for some reason, I was just never any good at exams. I just didn't get how exams worked. Why, I don't know. But I was never any good at written exams. And going into my A-levels, basically I flunked. And I scraped a few grades. But Nottingham University wouldn't have me. I didn't get the grades that they wanted. And I was devastated. Yeah. And I was like, what am I going to do? And my mum and dad said, well, you know, you can take up this insurance offer at Lancaster, because Lancaster was like a fairly naff university in those days. And it was the kind of place where most people went either on insurance offer or through clearance. Right. It was not the sort of place that people chose to go, especially not to do, you know, and it was biological sciences, it wasn't genetics. And I was, oh, really? And like, remember the Cornish pasties? The Cornish pasties are really good in the local bakery.
You kind of just I was like, oh well, at least that I can take that away from it.
So I did go, and I sulked for the first term, and in the second term I became a Christian, and I've lived in that place ever since.
So it was. I'd like to talk about that more, but it sounds like there was a bit of a divine, and sort of,
you know, this whole pattern of not being good at exams comes up again.
Yeah. So, well, you know, I do familiarize with that. You know, I went through, you know, I went through that sort of thing with my education. You know, I was never very academic. You know, I got averages, I got C's, my GCSEs, and I went and did a BTEC. Went to university, kind of struggled. I struggled academically, but also struggled because I had quite a chaotic home life as well. And I, for the longest time, sort of struggled with I got a 2.2 grade, which kind of basically excluded me from all of these. You know, there was all these kind of courses for graduates.
Yeah.
You know,
doing a master's
courses,
or whatever. Yeah.
Needed a 2-1. I wanted to actually be a teacher.
Right.
And I didn't have the grade.
Right.
So that, you know, that was like something that just shut me off, and I ended up just going, right, I'm going to go make some money instead, you know, and but it led me in a certain direction. Anyway, yeah. So for me, it's quite inspiring to hear your story. And to hear you say, well,
it gets better. It gets better.
Early failure. Well, we'll come back round to it, definitely. Now, just to, you know, just shift back to, again, what would you call it? Just do a segue or whatever. But we have a photo of you, Pam, in a T-shirt. You've
been doing your research. I wonder who your agent was.
Nathan's just put it up on the screen there. You can see it. Yeah. So I saw this T-shirt.
That T-shirt was a gift from my staff when I left NISCU.
I saw a T-shirt, and so for people listening, in case you're not watching the video, but the T-shirt says, "I can do all things through a verse taken out of context," and you seem to be quite proud wearing that T-shirt as well. Obviously, if it was a gift, then that's great, but obviously, what I'd be interested in is what the significance is behind that. I mean, obviously, they bought you that T-shirt because you're the kind of person who would wear it.
Well, yes, I was the kind of person who would wear it, but it was a quote that I was apt to make. My role within NISCU, I handled safeguarding, I handled health and safety. I wrote every kind of policy under the sun. Name a policy, I've written it. And I will be very glad to never, ever write another policy in my entire life. So in case anybody's thinking, don't. But one of my roles as well was pastoral care, almost like a chaplaincy role with the staff team, just looking after them pastorally and teaching Bible with them. Because, you know, they needed, as schools workers going into schools and working with young people and children, they needed a fairly decent Bible background, so that was part of my role, was to support them in all of that. And one of the things I often used to say was, look, you can't just pick a proof text and that's it, because if you do that, you can come up with all sorts of rubbish. And I used to say this often to them, the actual Bible verse says, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And people use that in all sorts of ways that are completely wrong in terms of what it means in the context where Paul is talking about being content whether he's got a lot or being content whether he's got nothing. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. That sense of that's what he's talking about. He's talking about being content whether you've got a lot or whether you've got very little. You can still do it in Christ. And that's what he's talking about. He's not talking about, I struggled to pass my driving test, but I'm going to be a Formula One racing driver because I can do all things. No, that's not. That's taken out of context. And one of my big things was with the staff was always read things in context. Read them in the historical context, read them in the biblical context, read them in the immediate context of what's being said, all those levels of context. Which is just really, really important for your Bible reading.
Is there an example from yourself, from your own life, or from perhaps you don't have to mention names, but someone who took a Bible verse out of context and?
Okay, here's a well-known example, and I'm not going to give you a specific quotation.
Okay.
But there's a certain genetics expert who was a very well-known atheist. Who seems to address what he sees as issues within Christianity that actually are straw men. But because his understanding of Christianity is really not that strong, he's a brilliant, brilliant evolutionist, he's a brilliant geneticist, but he knows very little about Christianity, actually. And he speaks into that. Because he's an expert in one field, he assumes it. He wrote a whole book about it, didn't he?
Yes, the God delusion and everything. Yeah. I actually started. I tried reading that, and I did start. I got through the first chapter, but it was so full of. I think
theological error.
I think the problem is when you're trying to attack something rather than critique, the moment you sort of make that stumbling error of misinterpreting something, misinterpreting your opponent, for example, at that point, the foundations of your argument will start to crumble.
Yes, I agree.
Whereas if he was genuinely critiquing Christianity, there's obviously a lot of things you can pick apart, and Christian theologians are very good at picking apart that as well. They all have different ideas about stuff, The interesting one, Andrew Scotland, who was our first guest, who's our pastor, I had, a lot of talks with him about the sons of God, and that's what we discussed in the first episode or second episode. And that's very interesting, right? Because there's a lot of view, and my personal view, and a lot of people who are Christians have the view of the sons of God being, the angels, the fallen angels, and then you have Goliath, the giant. But Andrew's point of view of that, he's done a lot of research on the history. His view is they're people, they're humans who were perhaps endowed with special knowledge. And it's very interesting because then you go into the whole flood, and you go into, and you can even make an argument from evolution point of view of saying, actually, and this is something I go back and forth on, right? I go back and forth on evolution myself, right? I don't particularly hold a very strong view. Although, looking at DNA, it's like, wow, this is definitely designed some way. But for me, it's like, you could always have that, there's arguments there from the Bible you could use to support evolution, I think. But there's also the strong arguments that it's like it's creation and Adam and Eve, the first people. But there's that kind of Adam and Eve and their family line versus the people. And then you have these special ones who have knowledge, and you have these ordinary people. So anyway, that's, I don't want to go, we won't go into that.
I'm with you. I hold the whole thing very lightly.
Yes, yeah.
Because we don't know enough. We don't know what we don't know.
Yes. Yes.
Is it 90% of the universe is dark matter about which we know virtually nothing? If we know virtually
Yeah.
nothing about 90% of the universe,
Yeah.
we're not really going to have definitive answers.
People tend to misinterpret dark matter, don't they? Because they're thinking dark matter means, oh, it's like a black blob of matter of some kind, but it's not. What they mean by dark matter is actually it's just,
What they mean
you know,
is
there's
complete
something
ignorance is
there
what they mean.
that is, yeah, there's something there that is sort of,
Yeah.
again, I am speaking as a layman, but
Me too, in that particular aspect.
because there's the Star Trek movie, isn't there? The
Oh,
Star Trek
you've
movie
mentioned the magic words now.
the spot with Spock, and he has this, isn't he? He's carrying in his, I think he's carrying his spaceship the red matter, isn't he? Yeah, and it was like this red matter blob, and it was this whole plot around this red matter, and I think, you know, even at the time, I think even scientists were like,
can we just address this once and for all? Star Wars is just New Ageism. And
Right.
honestly, no. Star Trek is in the Bible.
Right.
Because Deuteronomy 5, verse 33, does say, live long and prosper. So QED, moving swiftly on.
But isn't it? Doesn't God also say in the Bible? And I'm not going to say any verse, but I think it's very clear. He says, "I am your father." You know. So there you go, Luke. I am your father.
But then, you know, we all have fathers, don't we?
Yes,
So I don't think that's a gotcha, really. I'm sorry, Wes.
Well. Anyway, I thought we could debate that. We could debate definitely on Star Wars versus Star Trek. Maybe for another episode, we'll just do that one. You know. Okay, so you mentioned the NISCU, and you were, when you joined that, you cheekily admitted to praying for a laptop, and
I did.
your prayers were answered. You received a MacBook when you took on the role.
It was the first day on the job, and the managing trustee said, "Pam, you're going to need a laptop. Will a MacBook do?"
Yeah.
And I'm not somebody who often prays for stuff, because stuff isn't all that important. It was a means to an end, because I wanted to do some writing and things. I never imagined that 17 years later it would be like dozens of policies that I would have written, but you know, but yeah, that was my introduction to owning a laptop.
Well, thanks for listening to this episode. We've run out of time, but we have more of the second part of our interview with Pam coming up, so please check out the next episode of Life Explored.